Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in.
Anytime.
Let's begin by reminding ourselves what the President signed into law. Can I begin with you, Johan?
Sure thing. So basically we saw 4 main pieces of legislation, and without getting too bogged down in the details, we're going to see changes to strike law, impacts on how trade unions must ballot, picketing, and under which circumstances disputes can be referred to advisory arbitration. So there's significant change in relation to strikes and picketing that will impact on us. There's of course the national minimum wage that will come into effect on the 1st of January. And then we've seen some modernization of leave regimes to recognize adoption, adoptive parenting, and same-sex partner relationships in respect of child rearing.
Yeah.
And all of that, from my perspective, all very positive changes to our labor landscape.
Absolutely. But by far the most contentious, of course, has to be the national minimum wage and the various arguments that have been presented by people, some saying that you are going to see this benefit coming to some 6 million workers, and others suggesting that you may well see huge job losses. Let's begin with your analysis, and then we get Tebogo.
Sure thing. I mean, there's been figures branded about of 700,000 job losses, that workers will lose their jobs because employers would no longer be able to employ them if they have to up their salary to meet the national minimum wage standard. And whilst I have sympathy for employers who may be in a position like that, I think there's a lot of that position is frankly overstated. We've been living with sectoral determinations in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act for over 2 decades.
Yeah.
Those sectoral determinations did exactly the same thing. It set minimum wages in various sectors and industries.
Yeah.
And if we look back at history, we haven't seen large-scale redundancies as a result of the introduction of minimum wages in those sectors.
Yeah.
So I think businesses will find ways of living with it.
Yeah.
It may have an impact on the wage negotiations, because if you have a limited pot of money that you can make available for wage negotiations, and
Yeah.
you have to use a significant portion of that to up people's salaries to meet the national minimum wage standard,
Yeah.
it may leave you with less money for the negotiations with trade unions in respect of other employees.
Yes.
So that may be an interesting dynamic that we'll have to deal with.
I'll come back to you and ask you who is that employer who may be in a position where they are unable to pay that amount of money that we're talking about, 3,500 Rand a month per employee. Tebogo, your perspective.
Right. I agree with what Johan said, and perhaps the critical part of what he said is employers need to find a way in which to adjust to the national minimum wage.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, there is a fluctuation in terms of what's estimated as far as job losses due to the minimum wage.
Yeah.
But in essence, from a business perspective, there will be an impact. One needs to consider the fact that you do have existing employees.
Right.
For all intents and purposes, you might have an employee who's actually already earning 20 Rand, and
Yeah.
new entrants now would be bumped up.
We need to now come in at 20 Rand
Absolutely.
an hour.
So
Yeah.
now they want to be earning the same salary.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things might cause some animosity within the business.
Yeah.
So one needs to perhaps be ahead of that.
Yeah.
And those kinds of things will perhaps affect the employer's labor bill.
I want to talk about those kind of employers. Who are they? Which sectors are they in?
Well, I think more than anything else, most sectors are governed by your bargaining council, and as Johan said, we have sectoral determination. So the sectors which are not perhaps governed already in terms of wages,
Yeah.
those kind of sectors will be affected. So it's important that one looks for specific strategies in terms of combating or mitigating those kinds of risks.
Yeah.
It's not a knee-jerk reaction to say, now the minimum wage is here, one needs to retrench. You need to look at various options,
Yeah.
one of which is a temporary employment service provider,
Right.
whereby you can have a fixed contract with an employee,
Yeah.
and use them for a period in which you need them. So
Yeah.
if you're at your peaks,
Yeah.
you put them in.
Did
and
I
then
hear you say that's where you come in? Johan, your perspective. Who's
coincidence.
likely to be impacted?
So I think in the farm working agricultural sector, I fear that there may be a bigger impact there, notwithstanding the fact that they've been subject to a sectoral determination. My understanding, and from listening to clients who are operating in that industry, I think there will be an impact there.
Sure.
And this is also where there's a large risk of mechanization, where employers may say, instead of increasing my labor cost in order to meet the national minimum wage,
Yeah.
I'm rather going to do a capital expenditure and invest
Get in a machine.
mechanization and do
Yeah.
it. So that is where my own biggest concern lies. Having said that, I mean, you touched on the point earlier on to say that there is mechanism within the law to allow employers to apply to the National Minimum Wage Commission and say, I just cannot afford, this business cannot afford to meet the national minimum wage for a period, and please give me some latitude so that I can ramp up and meet that standard, and the Commission will consider applications like that. Also, domestic workers have been excluded from that, as farm workers for the initial period at least. So there is a reprieve.
So they may continue to earn below that 20 rand an hour minimum.
Correct. There's a phasing in period that's envisaged. And we must also not forget that the National Minimum Wage Commission, within the next 18 months, must already reconsider the national minimum wage. We've heard arguments from the trade unions saying that national minimum wage was supposed to come into effect on the 1st of May already.
You know, it should be back pay.
Correct, and we've seen the decreased value now of that 20 rand per hour, you know, 7 months later. So we're going to see some development, but there is mechanism within the law to deal with those employers who are faced with that stark contrast of saying, either must retrench staff, close the business, or not meet my obligations in terms of the Act.
Years ago, when I was starting out in journalism, there was a little saying, you know, when we were beginning to type and computers were coming in and you were learned how to type on a computer, the guys who were teaching us, and these were the sort of technical guys, the guys who fix the computers, etc., they would say to you, right, it's now time for the good men to come to the aid of the party. I'm reminded of that saying because I think it's now time for all patriotic South Africans to come forward and say this is for the national good, and anyone, honestly, who's earning less than 3,000 rand a month should really be earning at least that minimum. I think net-net, this is a good law, right?
I agree with you 100%. And whilst I'm not unsympathetic to small businesses, we need small businesses to grow. We need them to become employers. We can't rely on government or the large public sector businesses to continuously generate employment opportunities. I do think that this will benefit us as a nation going forward.
Absolutely. And South Africa is not the only place in the world where you have a minimum wage, and therefore we're just really just getting up to the global standard. Okay, let's talk about the other aspect. I like what you refer to as the strike law, because I think buried in the discussion and the noise around the national minimum wage has been this aspect of this law that's been signed as well. So labor unions, from now on, is that correct? From now on, they now need to ballot. From the 1st of January.
1st of January.
Before they go on strike, they must ballot. I must say, the sort of like, you know, equal rights guy in me says it is right that people must ballot before they go to a strike. But at the same time, I've also spoken to trade union leaders. In particular, I think I've spoken to Zolin Zima, I've spoken to Evan Jim, and their argument is that you elect leaders to represent you. Now you coming in and you saying, over and above that, you must reach out to the worker and decide whether the worker is going to wants to strike or not strike. Is this a good law for the unions, for employers, for the economy?
I think undoubtedly so. And Tebogo, I know in your clients in your industry deal with a lot of this issue as well. But from my perspective, and I must say to you, I grew up in the trade union movement many years ago. And even at that stage, you know, although it wasn't compulsory, we still had balloting as a good practice and a good standard within the trade union before you go on strike, because it's such a dramatic and intervention, you know, where you're putting your members as a trade union out there without any earnings, and you're saying to them, support this cause. What we have seen, you know, and I don't want to say this has happened all over and every strike is like that, but you have the ability where individuals within a movement can hijack the opportunity and take workers out on strike. And my personal sense is that I think a lot of the intimidation, the violence we've seen during strike action is because there's not a large-scale buy-in to the strike action. So workers have to be intimidated or threatened in order to participate in the strike. I'm hopeful that a secret ballot, as envisaged with within the law now, will avoid that, so that we have strikes when workers, by and large, buy into this and say, we're going to go out on strike and we're going to support this. Nobody has to coerce us, nobody has to threaten us, nobody has to intimidate us. We buy into why we're going on to the strike.
Absolutely. Tebogo, let's get to your perspective.
All right. What Johan said is accurate. What we have learned perhaps throughout the years is that the more violent the strike is, the more effective it is. The violence extends further internally to the strikers. And as he said, you might find a situation whereby the minority is the ones who are perhaps pushing this, who are keen on the strike.
And the majority perhaps are no longer in it.
Absolutely. So I think with the new Labor Relations, or the amended Labor Relations Act, it would perhaps cure those kinds of issues, and perhaps when there is a strike, we will know that the majority do want to strike.
Yeah, but the unions will argue that because they are electorates of the unions that they represent, because they consult, because before they go on strike, they actually go back and speak to their members. They are the voice of the unions. And what is required in a strike situation, which is a confrontational one, if you like, is strong leadership. And sometimes when you need to get what you need to get, you do need a little bit of pain.
Of course. But what you must perhaps consider is that strikes are not perhaps a minor thing. The strikes can have a major impact, not only on perhaps the one employee or the one employer, but perhaps throughout the entire economy can get affected. Therefore, I think for one to just focus on the fact that, listen, you need to get a mandate from your leader and that's where it ends. I don't think it's an accurate way to perhaps approach strikes.
Johan, this is coming on top, of course, of I think there was a court ruling on unions or people who organize strikes being held for damage to property. And if one were to sort of go back into the 1980s and think about the UK and Margaret Thatcher and how she broke the back of unions, could we be seeing a similar attempt here?
I would hate to think that any of the changes to the legislation has, even if it's just as a subject or a secondary aim, the intention of breaking the trade unions. That's certainly not my sense, and I think we'll be worse off as a nation if that is the case. But I seriously doubt that it is. I think it could have an impact on trade unions, but we also need to be realistic. I mean, if you look at what's happening, the concerns from external parties, S&P, Fitch, Moody, they've all expressed concerns about the unstable labor relations environment we have. I think that these changes are brought in exactly at the right time in order to inject some further stability within our employee relations environment. I do think that the fears and concerns about the instability and the inflexibility of our labor market are overrated. It's not nearly as bad as it may appear or maybe said in certain circles. I mean, if you consider our competitors in other jurisdictions, I mean, we deal with colleagues in other areas that tell us very similar stories to what we have here. What distinguishes us is this issue of violent strike. And I think if we can get a grip on that, we'll be much better off as a nation.
I wanted to remind you who put in those that South African labor law, by the way, post 1994. Do you remember his name?
Do remind me.
Chitombowe.
Of course, of course. And Mr. Mboweni may not be the favorite of anybody working at SAA at the moment, but you did right. And I'm embarrassed that I forgot.
The architect of South Africa's labor reform, becoming the democracy zone. All right. Let's talk about the other side of it, which is a bit of a fun one, because we're talking about rights, as you said. You see, I like the way you phrased it when we began the discussion. You referred to it as it's reform, yes, but it's also almost like updating and bringing South Africa's labor laws up to global standards. In particular, what is this change in the Labor Laws Amendment Bill?
Okay, so what we see both in
I like the bit about paternity.
What we had, when the Basic Conditions of Employment Act was brought into legislation in 1997, it gave us a right to maternity leave. Where we were left behind is, what do you deal with parents, with adoptive parents, with surrogacy, and with same-sex parenting relations? What we have now seen, this comes on the back of Labour Court judgments on that issue, where the court expressed the concern and say, listen, the BCA, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, ought to be amended to give effect to that. We have now seen a liberalisation of our leave framework to allow leave for parents in same-sex relationships, for adoptive parents, and for surrogacy. And those are changes that should be welcomed. We're not close to where we are as far as the Scandinavian countries are concerned, where either parent can elect.
But they're rich and they've got a little bit of fat to enable people to stay at home.
This is true, but I think it should be seen in a positive light. I think it will give a larger number of parents out there the opportunity to take care of the child-rearing aspects that we believe are so critical for the growth of our nation. Step in the right direction.
Absolutely, including, of course, fathers being able to take, is it 10 days?
10 days, 10 days parental leave.
10 days parental paternity leave. I don't know about you, Tebogo. You could be having another one?
Yeah, of course.
Absolutely, so you're going to be taking advantage of that. Johan?
Well, just to take the 10 days parental leave, it sounds to me like buying a 747 to get free peanuts.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming, but I'm sure there will be many happy fathers out there. Thank you for coming and discussing those changes to the law signed into the law by President Cyril Ramaphosa.